So Derek, I know we've done this before, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Sure. My name is Derek Evely. I am a track and field or athletics coach. I say track and field all the time now because I'm living in the U.S., but athletics coach primarily in the throws, although I have experience in all events. I'm also the owner operator of eviltracksport.com, where I sell videos and coach development information and strength and conditioning, speed, power, and specific track and field events. And it is also the home of my flagship course, the Bondarchuk system. So I was a mentee. I studied under Dr. Bondarchuk. He lived with me for a year when I brought him over to Canada in 2005. And yeah, so we he taught me a system which I use and teach today. And yeah, so I'm very proud of that. And it's gotten a lot of good feedback, actually.
Cool. So I know we've discussed a lot about the Bondarchuk approach last time, but still, I kind of want to like extend the question from last time. So the Bondarchuk approach is basically like uh no wave loading, no need to change, and no need to taper. Am I right?
Correct. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
The philosophy behind it is based on uh, an adaptive approach where you keep the stimulus as constant as possible and you allow the body to adapt um, on its own terms until it reaches peak condition. There's a lot of ins and outs and nuances to that, but that's essentially it. We don't use we relatively speaking, we don't use uh changes in volumes or intensities within a well, we don't change it at all within a cycle, what we call a PDSF, which could has huge variance depending on all kinds of issues, the number of exercises or programs that you use. But we do use change as a driver of adaptation between cycles. And that's a long discussion, but it's yeah. So that's so we use less, so like in speed power sports, we stay within a relatively, the specific window that we feel that we feel has a high transfer. There's those actual numbers are not really part of the system. The system is really about not changing whatever you feel those intensities are or those parameters are. And we can talk about that, but it's yeah, but it's really using exercise change to stimulate adaptation rather than changes, daily or weekly changes in intensities and volumes and things like that.
I'm
So it's
glad
a
you
lot different than a traditional system, but
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up like you change it through exercise selection. So in the Bondarchuk approach, I know there's like they categorize exercise into four different uh phases or
classification.
yeah. So can you like introduce us to this?
Sure. So there's four different classifications, and I'll go through them quick. But if you're, I've done a lot. I've done a number of podcasts. I've done a number of podcasts specifically on this before, and there's all kinds of information online. Although I would say you got to be careful because some people have taken the idea of the classification and they've really bastardized it in some ways. Then which is really not. I mean, maybe it works for them, but it's really not. It doesn't stay true to the system itself. If you try to use some of the way they see the classification within the system, you might have some problems. But essentially, um, and all the classifications are is a way to organize and classify the exercises that you have. It is not it in and of itself is not the Bondarchuk system. It's like a language that we use within the system. So that's important to understand because some people think, oh, yeah, I know how Bondarchuk works, and all they really all they really know is the exercise classifications, and that's it's one small part of it. So there's 4 classifications, and going from top to bottom, specific down to general. They are the competitive exercise, the specific development exercises, the specific preparation exercises, and the general preparation exercises. So this competitive exercise is the sport or activity that the athlete performs in. And so in my sport, if you are a shot putter, that is the shot put in and of itself. That's the event itself. If you're a hockey player, it's the sport of hockey. Okay, it's whatever that hockey activity is. So you can see from sport to sport, the CE will have a lot of variance depending if it's closed or open loop or those kinds of things. The way that, I mean, it's essentially defined as it looks like the sport and it acts like the sport. Okay, so and the CE, the competitive exercise, is the easiest to define because it's so simple as to what it is. It's the sport itself. Then below that, you have this specific development exercises. These are essentially the same as the competitive exercises, so they follow the competitive exercise or the sport in form and in function, so it looks like it and it acts like it. But these can also be broken down. So these are the competitive exercise broken down into its component parts. And with another addition onto that is that these can be overloaded. Sometimes these are overloaded. So an example of that might be if you are a soccer player and you are doing, short sprints with towing a weight, or you're a sprinter, short sprints towing a load. Those could be classified as an SDE. If you're a shot putter, then a standing throw would be an SDE. Okay, or any activity where you are doing the shot put motion. Say, we have lots of different exercises that we do to improve form in the shot put using as SDEs. And like if you took a dumbbell and you were pushing as fast as you can, or I have an athlete right now, 2 athletes that are competing. They're in high school. They compete in both the shot put and the discus, and they are doing an exercise where they're pushing a barbell as fast as they can onto a grass hill, and it rolls back down to them. That kind of thing. Okay. These exercises are really to drive form. Like these are the real meat and potatoes of developing form, or the SDEs, and of course the CE. You have to do the CE as well. That's your sport. And then after these are the SPE, specific preparation exercises. So generally speaking, for most sports, that means your traditional, as a good example, your traditional weight room exercises. Can you hang on one second? What are you doing? Bang it. Start again. Sorry about that. My dog was doing something. The SPE, specific preparation, these are generally your big ticket weight room exercises. I call them global strength abilities. So, squats, step ups, Olympic lifts, those kinds of things. And these, the formal definition of these in the system is that these exercises do not follow the competitive exercise in form, but they use their major muscle groups, okay? And they also follow in function. So if you're in a very explosive one-off sport like the shot put or the hammer throw or the discus or the long jump or something like that, the speed power sport or the speed power events in track and field, then your SPE exercises are going to generally speaking, follow that. The loading are going to follow those parameters, right? So your loading is going to be intensive and things like that. And then at the bottom of it, at the last one is the GPE, and those are general preparation exercises. They don't look like the competitive event. They don't act like the competitive event. These are the, you know, these are general exercises. For me, that means using a lot of exercises that that help an athlete maintain their general abilities. For me, specifically, these are exercises that are prophylactic in nature. You know, we do a lot of twisting exercises. You know, they're higher reps typically, so they don't, you know, they're not explosive, but it's that kind of thing, right? And so what actually sits in each one of those four classifications really depends on what sport you're in. Because a GPE in one sport would not be a GPE to another sport, let's say. So that's essentially it.
Cool. So since like you didn't wave load, you don't change the load rep sets and reps during the, like, let's say certain periods of time. So how do you like put in these like classification in the training system? Can you like give us some example?
Sure. So Dr. B he's come up with a number of different methods, which he calls within the system. So typically, so if you look at he has a number of books on periodization, okay? And these books on periodization present a lot of these methods. The first book is basically very similar to the book he and I wrote. I think we talked about it in our first podcast, that never saw the light of day. And I wrote all the charts for these different methods, right? So these different methods are within the system, and they are ways of organizing these various classifications, okay? So there's things like stage training, complex variation, and then there's block is another one. And so it's really just how you present these, okay? In our sport and in most sports, what you want to do is most sports will do better when you're using a complex methodology, if you buy into everything that the system, all the philosophies within the system. And what that means is that you're training all of your classifications all the time, okay? And you're not changing within it. That's what I don't want to get too deep into the definitions because we'll be here all day, right? That's what the course is for. But essentially, the complex, when you do a complex, it means you're doing everything at once. Stage means you'll do GPE and SPE first, and then SDE and CE, and they sort of stagger each other. They almost like they're a terrace, right? Block means you're going to do GPE and SPE in and of itself, and when that's finished, then you're going to do SDE and SPE, and that's the block, okay? So, those are all legitimate methods that are within the system that you can use. Your reasons for picking one or another are really depend upon, how you coach, what your preferences are, and to a large degree, what your environment is like. So in other words, there's one called stage. Oh, geez, I wrote them in and I can't remember. It's a combination method where there's all these different stages to it. And at the very end, you only do the CE itself at the very end for a short period of time. And you would look at that and you would go, well, why the hell would I do that? Because it makes no sense. And in my sport, that makes no sense. It means I'm not doing any technical work for most of the year. But if you're in a sport like ski jumping, okay, where you only have access to facilities, or you can actually only do your sport in its entirety at a certain point in the year, and that point is very short, well, that's the method you're going to use because it makes the most sense, right? Coaches that really have philosophies that are really strength driven might use a stage complex or a stage variation approach, because those approaches emphasize the more general qualities, the more general abilities, before they do the more specific ones. It's not a question of right or wrong. It's really about what you prefer. And so, for instance, for me, I always use the complex or the variation methods, because it's just the way I like to coach. And what I think works the best is that I like to train all abilities all the time. I can do it in my sport, and so those are the ones I use. The advantages to those is you reach peak condition faster. So there you go.
Here's one thing I don't understand. The complex approach is it like Charlie Francis, like vertical integration?
Yes. Yes. I mean, it's essentially it's like that. It's like Charlie's idea of vertical integration. But it's sort of taken to an extreme in that there is no, we don't change anything within the entire cycle. Okay. So in the last podcast, I showed you some graphs of a girl that I'm coaching. So, that was one program. That was a straight up complex, and she's at like, hey, I'm on a podcast. If you could, sorry, I know. Sorry about that. Sorry about the interruptions. And so those we don't change at all. As I said, when you come in the first day, what you see is what you're going to see the 50th day, the 50th time, right? So Charlie wasn't, he had more variance in his programming than that, but essentially the idea is that you're working on all abilities all the time within a cycle.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. So last time you also mentioned that using like the Bondarchuk approach, there's gonna be three reactions. Can you like explain it?
So Dr. B came up with this system. How he came up with it was doing a lot of research on loss of form, where he was studying Russian athletes. This is back when it was the old Soviet Union, and it was very easy for him to get data from hundreds and if not thousands of athletes, kind of thing. And so what he did is he started looking at what happens to an athlete's form, their condition, when they stop training, and how long, after 1 week of no training, after 2 weeks of no training, or a month or a year or whatever it was. And he studied all these athletes, and what he found was through that is that when athletes, not everybody loses form in the same way, right? So some athletes, no matter what you do, they just only lose so much form. They will only lose, within reason, right? But and some athletes, you stop training for 2 weeks, and they'll have like almost would call it a complete loss of form, but they're down to like 90%, which is a lot. Like if you're 90% of form, you're basically, you're almost, you're not untrained, but you're really starting your season over again in terms of training. And so he started looking at, what happens when they start, when you start training at these various points of form loss. And so when you start from a very low loss of form, you got basically nowhere to go but up. So if you follow their results, now this is when you're not wave loading volume and intensity. So that's important to understand. Then they basically will keep rising up to a peak condition, and it's not completely linear. There's going to be variations and fluctuations, but the general trend line will be just basically right up. and those athletes, I think I said, to start at about, lower than say 92 or 93% of form. And then there's the next level of athlete is athletes that start around, 93 to 96 or 97% of form. Let's call it 95. And what they do when they start training is they will initially have a drop in form and then come back up. So they're essentially like a 1, but they first go down before they come up. And then you have the third type of athlete where they start at a much higher level of condition. So they start at between 95 and 97%, let's say. And what they do is they plateau first, then they go down, then they come up. Okay. Whether your athlete is a 1, 2, or 3 makes it doesn't make a lot of difference in terms of what method you're going to try, unless you're a number 3, because number 3s are different in that if an athlete is highly trained and begins a new program, or or they're a natural 3, they don't lose form very easily. Let's say they've taken some time off, but that they don't lose form easily. When they start back up again, performances are relatively good. Athletes like that do not respond well to variations, a lot of variation in training. So if you're changing the program often, those athletes they're not going to grow as fast. In the charts you look at in the book, it represents that as basically a flat line. They just won't improve. Yeah, they'll probably get some improvement, but it's not ideal. And that's essentially what we found. What I found working with athletes is athletes that's, for whatever, if they're starting at a high level of form and you change the program, then you're going to expect a bit of plateau for a while. Then they're going to drop. Then they'll come back up. So essentially how it works.
Why at the beginning? Why do you watch the form instead of things like power output or like some sort of force plate metric, that kind of stuff?
Oh, how do we measure it?
No, I mean,
like how do
why?
we know if they're in form or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to have some kind of metric that you're tracking them with, right? So in the throws, the thing that's, and one of the reasons why this was so easy, why he developed this, because he was a throws coach, and the especially back then, the advantage to the throwing events, especially the heavy throws, the shot put, discus, and hammer, are that you can throw every day, right? Like these athletes, and we know, I mean, we've thrown up to 10 times a week, 2 sessions a day for 5 days, right? Where they can throw at a high intensity. And we can measure. So what's unique about that is that we get a daily, direct, very specific measure of form. We can get it every day. We just measure how far they can throw, right? So that's not, which is different, say, than from a football player, a soccer player, that, how do you measure whether a soccer player is a better athlete, a better soccer player every day? It's very hard to do, right? And, how do you know? So athletes in those sports have to find measurables that work for them and that are specific to their sport and track that, right, as often as possible. But, through looking at throw, and now it's a bit different today, or there's a bit more, there's more sports that you can do, that you can get very daily specific measurables, because we have some technology now that really helps us, like bar accelerometers and GymAwares and things like that, right? So we can, and then there's a whole question as to whether that means that they are in peak condition. And I found that it does, at least in the throwing events. The rise in bar speed, faster bar speeds with the same load, is essentially like throwing the same weight every day in one of the throws and measuring the distance, and those two trend lines reactions, what we call, which I just discussed, those are very similar. So they improve with most exercise, most global strength abilities. They will grow basically the same. They will follow the same trend line. And so that is a big advantage to throws coaches, because number one, if I can't get a throwing, like I'm from Canada, so if I can't get a throws, a measurement every day, but I can get a bar speed measurement every day, then I can use that because I know, generally speaking, when they peak with their bar speeds, they're going to be peaking with their throw. So if I'm throwing into a net all winter, how do I know if they're reaching peak conditions? Well, I just follow the bar speed. The other thing it does is when you establish a correlation between your specific measure, your CE measurables, and your bar speeds, and you have to be able to do that or have a very good idea of it, then the bar speeds act as a backup for what you're seeing in your highly specific CE measurable. So I will, because sometimes, athlete will have a big day, a throwing day where they'll have an exceptionally good day early on in a cycle, or exceptionally poor day. And how do I know whether that means they're in peak condition, or they're coming into peak condition, or loss of form? And so I use the bar speeds as well to back it up. It's just another piece of information that I can use to determine that. So
Nice. So just out of curiosity, does the Bondarchuk approach also can be used in, like, let's say I'm a 100-meter sprinter, can it also be used to, like, the technical session for the short sprint?
yeah, it can be used in any sport, right? The only difference is the main differences are, how are you going to collect measurables? How do you change, how do you vary your exercise from cycle to cycle? But the big one is, and this is where people get very confused with it, is they'll listen to this podcast and they hear me say, oh yeah, well, we throw 10 times a week and we lift 10 times a week, because we do this. We're very specific about the complex method, right? Like, so for us, it means not only is it doing all exercises in every cycle, it's doing all exercises in every workout. Okay. So we write a program, and it might be 2 programs, 3 programs, but those within those 1, 2, or 3 programs, how many will have all exercise classifications. And so, but they hear us doing it, and where we can write in the heavy throws, we can write one program and do it 10 times a week. And people think, oh, that's the Bondarchuk method. It's not really. It's this idea of compressing the compression of these specific abilities, training these specific abilities leads to peaking or reaching peak condition faster. But it's just not feasible in most sports. You can't sprint 10 times a week at a high intensity. You'll kill the athlete. So you have to use your brain, and you have to use some common sense. But the point is that you want to be as SWAT as you can, which means as precise as you can with your exercise selection. Use as few exercises as you can, divide them up in as few programs as you can. That may be 3 programs, and one of those programs might be a recovery section or something, but you just cycle those 3 over. All it means is that you're going to reach peak condition a little later than a thrower would. So in the throws, if you do the Bondarchuk method and you have an athlete that reaches peak condition between 40 and 50 sessions, you can probably get about 4 to 5 peaks in a year. Well, you're just, with most sprinters, unless you're really creative and you're really, you're just not going to do that. You might get 3 or 4, maybe 3 or 4 real peaks, real true peak conditions. And so it's just the way it is. And so, even within the throws, I don't think it can be done with javelin. I don't think you can't throw a javelin 10 times a week. You'll destroy the athlete's arm. And so, that event, I would use 2 or 3 different programs. And so they're only doing the actual CE, like 2 to 3 times a week.
Nice. So, last question before I let you go. So, no need to like change. So, since that, how do you know that when will athletes
Well,
gonna
no
be?
need to change until they reach peak condition.
Yeah,
When they
yes.
reach peak condition, then you have to change. You have no choice, because if you don't, they're gonna start to crash. So
Sorry about that. But uh uh since it's not you don't have to change before they reach peak, how do you know when are they gonna reach peak? What if they reach their peak performance like 3 weeks before the meet? Or what if they reach peak after the meet?
so this is where it gets, you have to experiment with it. You have to know the athlete. You have to really understand the system and the nuances within it. Okay. So essentially, let's say if I know an athlete reaches peak condition in 50 sessions of the same workout. Okay. So if I have same program, we call it workout, program, session, same thing. Okay. Different words for the same thing. It's a training unit of one training unit. Well, if I have three different units, that's going to take 150 total sessions for them to reach peak condition. That's why I will only use one if I can get away with it. Okay. Sometimes I'll use 2 with throwers, but usually it's one. It's one. And again, if it's a javelin thrower, it's probably going to be 2 or 3, right? So with them, so if I know, let's say I'm using one program and I know it takes 50 sessions, I'm going to look at, when I go to do my periodization, I'm going to plan for competition. I'm going to look at when I want them to peak. I'm going to look at a calendar, and I'm going to back it up, and I'm going to start, where I can fit in 50 sessions. And at that point, that's going to be, so if it's a thrower in the heavy throws and they're training 5 times a week and it's 50 sessions, that's going to be 10 weeks. So 10 weeks prior to when I want them to reach peak condition, that's when I'm going to start that program that's going to lead them into the competition phase. Okay. Now, if you're another reason why I like doing fewer programs is because it gets complicated. If you have 2 programs, that will reach, then it's going to take 100 sessions if they peak in 50. And the way they peak, how many it takes to peak, is you have to experiment with it. You have to try it out. So you don't want to try this out in the competitive season. You want to start it in the off season and then determine how long it takes them to reach peak condition. And so if that's 2 sessions, it's going to be 100. Then I'm going to start 20 weeks before, because it's going to take twice as long. But then it can get complicated, because if those 2 sessions are not, I may write them as 2 different sessions, but if the brain sees them differently, or sees them as the same. So in other words, if the content of those 2 sessions is too similar, then the brain is going to think, okay, it's like, even though I've written it as 2 sessions and I plan for 20 weeks, they're going to peak in 10, because the brain is going to see that as really 1 session, right? Or 1 program, one program session. And then I'm going to be wondering why after 10 weeks they've reached peak condition, right? Which is fine, because then I just have to be able to maintain it, or go into another 10-week cycle with 1 program or something like that. I mean, I go through all of this in the course, and how to do that. So you really, you have to choose your exercises carefully, and there's a lot of nuance to it. When it's done right, it's never failed me. Like, I've never had it not work. And when it works really well. So I guess one other question would be, what if you know they say they peak in 50 sessions and you get to 50 sessions and they've trended up, but they didn't really hit a peak, or they didn't have a PR, they didn't improve from the last time they did it. Well, all that means, it didn't mean the system didn't work. It just means your exercise selection, the exercises you chose in that PDSF didn't do its job. It wasn't good enough it wasn't enough stimulus there to rise form. It wasn't a good enough program. If it's a weak program, they'll come into a peak at 50 sessions. It's just that peak's not going to be great. It's just maybe the performance won't be as high as you want it to be. So it's, but that's like any other training system. You have to choose the right exercises to drive form. You got to find out what transfers, right? So if I know if I have an A group of exercises that I know an athlete typically reacts well to, I'm going to hold those back throughout the year, or especially like the second to last PDSF. I'm going to hold those back for that last PDSF leading into the main competition. Or, maybe I'll pull some of those special exercises, those unique ones with a high transfer. I might pull them in and out throughout the variation phase during the competitive season, because leading into the competitive, say I have a 6-week competitive cycle, or a 6-week period where I need them to be, there's a whole series of meets. I want them to throw well in all of them. I'm going to have a full PDSF that's going to bring them into peak condition at the beginning of that 6-week cycle. And then every 2 weeks or so, I'm going to switch out the cycles. I'm going to switch out the exercises within the cycles, and that will maintain the form, and they'll even grow through that a little bit. So, but that's a whole other discussion in terms of variation in that. But again, I go through it in the course.
Love that. So that's kind of all the question I have for the Bondarchuk approach for right now. So if there's
You covered all the basics.
Yeah. So if there are coaches are interested in what we are talking about today, where can they reach out to you, and where can they find the course you mentioned?
Yeah. So if you go to eviltracksport.com, that's EVELTRAK sport, SPORT.com. You'll find the Bondarchuk system, and you can find, if you have, if you want to contact me, my contact information is on the site there. You can just look me up and ask me if you got some questions. But yeah, so, and I have other courses on there too, but that's where the Bondarchuk course sits, and you can just sign up and start taking it. I've had about 300 to 400 people take it. I've never had any negative feedback. I've had only positive feedback with people taking it from all kinds of different sports. And I've had, typically the feedback I will get is people are like, I can't believe the initial growth that I get after doing this. Once they stop wave loading, volume, and intensity, and if they do it right, it's crazy the amount of growth that you can get out of it. It doesn't last forever like any system, if you keep doing the same thing, you're going to have to change at some point. But yeah, the feedback's been very good.
Cool. Love it.